Right now I'm the northernmost inhabitant of Tasmania. I'm on Erith Island, which is in Bass Strait. It's in the Kent group of islands. I was introduced to this place by the historian Stephen Murray Smith. At the time of his death, he was working with me on this script, and I've used a lot of his material in the history that I've put together here. Erith's only a small island. It's not very important. But these objects here, they're clues to some of the fascinating history of this corner of Australia. Thursday, the 8th of February, 1798. Shortly after dawn, a group of islands is sighted to the east from the colonial schooner Francis, making a third trip south to the wreck of the Sydney Cove on Preservation Island. The 24-year-old Lieutenant Matthew Flinders saw the land as
high and steep, consisting of irregular lumps of land, which at first made as one island, but in running past, two smaller ones divided from the northwest. An opening appeared in the main body of 3/4 of a mile wide, seemingly deep and clear. The islands were called Kent's groups in honour of my friend Captain William Kent, then commander of the Supply.
While the Francis was being prepared to leave Preservation Island with the last of the cargo of the Sydney Cove, Flinders took the opportunity to explore Armstrong's Channel between Clark Island and the south side of Cape Barren Island.
On the smooth sloping parts of Rocky Point, there were many seals, most of whom precipitated themselves into the water as we rode by. On this point, the number of seals exceeded anything we had any of us before witnessed. The sailors killed as many of these harmless and not unamiable creatures as they were able to skin during the time necessary for me to take the requisite angles, and we then left the poor affrighted multitude to recover from the effect of our inauspicious visit.
The next time Flinders saw this island, he was with Bass. He was in the longboat Norfolk, which had been built on Norfolk Island. They were in the company of Charles Bishop in the brig Nautilus. What Bass and Flinders had come down to do was to prove that the waters to the west of this group of islands and the Furneaux group were in fact a strait and not an embayment. On the 17th of October 1798, they ran through the channel bisecting these islands.
It lays south-southwest through, is about 3/4 of a mile wide, and so deep did not reach the bottom. There are two coves on the east and one on the west side, in one or other of which small vessels might lie securely in all winds. At the back of these, and in some other places, the high bluff land is intersected by gullies, out of which gusts of wind come, which would often make it dangerous to carry much sail in passing through. We entered the channel with a fresh breeze, but were soon becalmed under the land, when, in a moment, a gust laid the gunwale so far under the water that the Nautilus expected to go to Furneaux's Island by herself.
Many of the sailors who came here after them repeated these same warnings. John Murray and the Lady Nelson in 1801 was given the task of charting the Kent group on the voyage on which he later discovered Port Phillip. On the 25th of November, he wrote in his log,
"As we approached the first cove, saw a large part of the island on fire, from which we conceived there might be people on shore. Kept standing up the sound and had furious gusts of wind at every point of the compass. We proceeded up with the sails, sweeps and boat, but found it impossible to get to anchorage in it, as violent gusts constantly came down it."
He bore away to the cove on the west side and came to anchor here, just down here actually, at 7:30. On the next day, his log records the first written record of somebody landing on the island. He sent a couple of men ashore to look for water, and they came along the beach and they found there a piece of coir rope and a dead dog.
I fancy that Harrington must have been here, the dog being much like one of the Cummings.
The Harrington was a ship under William Campbell that had come out to Sydney with a crew of 35, armed with 6 guns. He came down here and went sealing. Later, he became a pirate in the Eastern Pacific, and there is a story that he buried treasure somewhere here in the Straits. But sealing takes us back to Charles Bishop and the Nautilus. Bishop was bound for the area where Flinders had seen the seals earlier in the year. He set up the first European settlement outside of Port Jackson, at Kent's Bay on the south side of Cape Barren Island. It was a base to hunt seals. It was the first settlement outside Sydney, excluding Preservation Island, where the survivors had built a house out of the wreck of the Sydney Cove. This was before Hobart was founded. It was before Bass Strait was discovered. It was only 10 years after the penal colony was started in Port Jackson. It was before the Blue Mountains had been crossed. And these seas very soon were swarming with sealers. Every corner of the whole strait was swarming with men. What they'd come for, of course, was the wealth that the oil from the seals and their skins would bring them. It was a brutal business, certainly for the seals, but also for the people who came here. Parties of them would be left on islands and rocks for, up to 2 years before the skippers of the boats that left them would come and pick them up. Stephen Murray Smith tells of one such occasion where a man was dropped off on Black Pyramid Rock, right on the other side of the strait. Here in the old sealing days, one sealer starved to death or died of thirst in a cave, finally too weak even to scan the horizon for the ship that never came. A year or two later, they found his body cured by salt spray, and we're informed, looking quite fresh. There were a varied lot of people. They were mainly seamen. There were ex-convicts. There were Americans, Maoris, and of course the Aboriginal women, both mainland and Tasmanian, that they captured to go and live with them, keep them company. Governor King observed,
"One cause of the want of agricultural labourers is the number of men employed by individuals in the seal and oil fishery."
sealing with whaling was Australia's staple industry up until the 1830s or thereabouts. In the period from 1800 to 1806, 100,000 sealskins were taken from here to Sydney. By 1813, when white men first crossed the Blue Mountains, the sealing part of this boom was on the decline. Greed had led to the destruction of the resource, as Governor King had warned.
From the different communications I have received, I shall find it expedient to restrain individuals from resorting there in too great numbers, and to fix certain times for their visiting those places, to prevent the destruction of that commercial advantage.
Signs of the sealers here on this island are these seal's teeth and this rum bottle, which my daughter found when she was digging a tent site. She found it amongst some seal bones. We know that the sealers operated over there on Deal Island and that they worked the whole group of islands. We also know that over there on Deal in 1803, which was a very busy year for ships, there was an international incident. The first non-English ship to pass this way was Le Géographe under the French explorer Nicolas Baudin the year before.
These terrific granitic rocks presented a majestic and dreadful spectacle, naked and barren. The roaring waves broke against them with such noise and force as seemed to threaten every instant to bury them under torrents of foam.
The American captain of the ship Charles, his name was Percival, was here in 1803 as well. He was refitting his ship somewhere over there on Deal. At that time, Captain Moody arrived on the boat Governor King, and he had 37 tons of oil on board and 700 sealskins. And he sent his crew off to do some sealing. And when they came back, they found the crew of the Charles lined up in 2 ranks,
through which they were ordered to pass down to one of the Americans' boats, upon threats of the worst of consequences upon a refusal to comply. The others, not obeying with the readiness insisted on, were immediately seized, their hands bound behind, and thrown into the boat headlong with some severe blows. They were then conveyed to a small island destitute of water, where they continued 6 hours before Mr. Moody, who had remained on board, discovered their distressed situation.
That island was either this one or Northeast Island. The article went on to criticise the United States of America for interfering in colonial concerns.
Such is our veneration for the American character, that we should willingly have passed over in silence an outrage committed by a few inconsiderate individuals. But from the very material consideration that we should have exposed ourselves to censure as being unconscious of our duty to the colonial trader, who, although incompetent to retaliate violence and insult, may, when apprised, endeavour to avoid a treatment to which he could only submit with unfailing resentment and regret.
The sealers' main camp was at Garden Cove on Deal. The protector of Aborigines, George Augustus Robinson, came there in 1831.
We found the sealers had been gone for some time by the appearance of the huts, which were built of bags tied with hay bands and thatched with grass. The situation is in a valley, and a stream of water runs through the settlement. Found some poultry, also some flour, potatoes, and a musket in a hut. Found one whaleboat and 2 dinghies. At 8 p.m. the captain and one of the sealers, John Taylor the American, came to the huts.
It was John Taylor who later told him that one of the sealers, Gamble,
shot the woman from inside the house. He was firing at a stump, and the woman jumped up from behind the stump and ran into the house when she was shot, and took the man she lived with by the collar, and then dropped down dead. Saw the grave where she was buried. Left a written notice requiring the sealers at Kent's group to render up the Aboriginal females. It had been reported to me that 2 of the men at Kent's group were absentee convicts, and this was the principal inducement for me to wait a short time. For although I was persuaded that the native women could be obtained and would be rendered up, yet it was obvious they would not render up the convicts.
When Canon Brownrigg visited here in 1872, he came across a grave. It's somewhere here on Erith, and I don't quite know where. But in this book, Mission to the Islands, which is the story of Brownrigg's visits, he tells something about this. Before leaving the island, we visited a spot of melancholy interest. It was the grave of a young seaman, aged 21 years, who accidentally met his death by a gunshot. The grave's been securely railed in, and a headboard bears an inscription, some few words of which we are unable to decipher. It was as follows.
A.J. Christian Jacobson met his death by the accidental discharge of a gun. He came on shore with his captain to shoot rabbits, went poking at a penguin in a bush with his gun, holding the gun by the barrel, when it went off and shot him through the breast. He died at midnight. May he rest in peace. If this meets the eye of anyone going shooting, it is hoped it will make them additionally careful.
Whilst that grave is no longer marked, that of ship's boy George Philpotts still is. The original cross is now in the museum on Deal. George, who died over 100 years ago, was on HMS Myrmidon, whose commander, R.F. Hoskin, was making the chart of Murray Pass, which is still used today. Brownrigg's clerical predecessor, Bishop Nixon, visited the group in 1857. As he was leaving,
felt a sense of relief when a gentle breeze sprang up and carried us safely beyond our perils. To climb those perpendicular cliffs would have been impossible, even for a chamois hunter. Had the boats failed us in such a predicament, we must all have perished.
Hoskin's predecessor, Commander J. Lord Stokes, whose name still appears on the charts of Bass Strait, has similar trouble in 1842 in HMS Beagle. HMS Beagle was the ship, incidentally, which Darwin sailed on his memorable voyage.
The sea, still vexed and chafing from the breeze of yesterday, rolled in with solemn grandeur on the storm-beaten sides of the islands, each heaving swell carrying the ship nearer towards the almost fatal opening. Her motions, however, as if she was conscious of the fate that threatened her, were sluggish and slow, and she seemed unwillingly to obey the impulse of the light southerly breeze that aided her progress. Indeed, there appeared to be an opposing tide until we drew in between the high rocky sides of the channel, when suddenly the ship was hurried on with such rapidity that to prevent our being swept past a cove on the right, it was necessary to close with its outer point, towards which a merciless eddy flung the ship's head so rapidly that before the thrown-back sails checked her way, her jib boom was almost over the rocks. During the few awful moments that succeeded, a breathless silence prevailed, and naught was heard but the din of waters that foamed in fury around, as if impatient to engulf us in their giddy whirl. Still it must be confessed that our breasts sickened within at the thought that our little bark, after having braved so many storms and done so much good service to the state, might be left to whiten a foreign shore with her timbers.
But what of these timbers here? They're from a sailing ship, and I guess it was a pretty big one. But there's no other pieces of it around, so I expect it drifted here from somewhere else, perhaps from King Island or Cape Otway over there. But while we don't know when this ship was wrecked, we do know about the schooner Boscan. It was wrecked in 1866. Some say over there on the west point of Erith, and others say it was on the south point of West Cove. The St. Nicholas, a converted naval boat, was fishing here in 1961, on its maiden voyage actually, when it went aground. 98 years before the St. Nick went up, in 1863, the General Jessup ended up on the beach down there. And this nail either came from her or from another ship that came up still earlier in 1816. That was the Brothers. And the captain of that ship was William Hovell. He's the Hovell of human Hovell. And when they were wrecked here, what they ate was penguins and a porridge made out of tallow and the wheat that was the cargo of the ship which had washed up on the beach. Well, for fear of starving on what they called this unfriendly rock, they built a coracle. It was a kind of basket made out of tea tree and covered with sealskins. And they set off in that coracle and they went out through there heading for Port Dalrymple. Now it wasn't long before the weather changed and that drove them back, but it wasn't the only thing that drove them back. They were attacked by sharks, attracted of course by the sealskins. Well, that was the first boat that was ever built on this island, or the first one that we know about. Hovell used this design when he and Hume were crossing the Murray in 1824.
The weather was more like this when the steamer Bulleye sheltered here in 1877.
On leaving, she struck a rock near North Island and returned to sink in this bay where she still lies. This copper-sheathed plank is from the wreck of one of the ships that stranded on the beach. Behind it is a house which was maintained by Stephen Murray Smith, with whose family and others I spent many summers holidaying here. It was built in the 1950s by fisherman Jack Learick, who also built a boat here. A previous hut had been built at the turn of the century by a man called Fitzgerald, when he had the grazing lease now held by Brian Stackhouse, whose stockyards overlooked the beach. The graziers, holiday makers, sealers and castaways have left these signs of Erith's limited occupation. After all, Flinders had said that the islands
seemed to be shunned by almost every kind of animated beings.
The early explorers had believed that Tasmania was part of the mainland because of the presence of the Aborigines. On showing that it wasn't, Flinders wondered,
how could it be that men should have reached the more distant land and not have attained the islands intermediately situated?
An answer to this question lay with a stone I picked up here in 1974, which was to reveal much more of the history of this beautiful place. I was walking on that sandblow with Don Anderson from the Australian National University when I picked up what I was sure was an Aboriginal artefact. He suggested we show it to archaeologist Rhys-Jones, also from ANU. Well, that's the stone, Rhys. What can you tell us about it?
Well, it's a flake. It's made out of a hard material. It's got a very sharp edge here. It's been struck off a core, and you can see the previous flake scars. And this is the flake scar from which of the flake itself where it was struck. Now you can see here, I'll make a drawing of it, that you have the flake itself, which is a shape like so, and then there is this, what is called a little bulb of percussion here, which is a little bulb coming from a single point, And then you've got these ripple marks, which you can see on the face of the flake itself. And that shows that the flake was struck hard in this direction here. And what was happening was that the flake was actually part of a larger rock, which was held in the hand, and then with a big hammerstone, they just went crack, and then the flake just came off. And it's got this very sharp edge. In fact, I can cut my finger very, very easily with this edge. And it's probable that it was this edge which is what people were actually wanting to make. And with this sharp edge, you can actually cut, for example, fur of kangaroos, and you can cut the meat, you can cut the sinews. That's one function. The other function is to cut vegetable food. For example, the stems of edible rushes. And these things grow in the swamps, and you can cut the stems of the rushes, and then you can get at the edible stuff, which is half in the swamp. So this kind of tool, simple though it is, could be used for a wide variety of cutting purposes.
Well, Rhys, somebody obviously dropped the stone, so I guess they must have been living on the island. And if you look at the island, it's no more than 2 kilometres in any direction. So that's perhaps 4 square kilometres. Would that have been big enough for somebody to live on?
I don't think so, actually. Even if you take the entire Kent group, that's only about 25 square kilometres. And I just don't think that this is big enough to be a viable area for hunters to live in for a long time. But then, obviously, these kind of stone tools produce a problem. You want to ask, it's not just who were the people, but when were the people? And this is where I, as an archaeologist, have certain skills to contribute. One has to think of the present-day islands, but in fact, they were not always islands, because if you go back to the end of the last ice age, when the world was much colder than it is at present, say 10 degrees Celsius colder, the Antarctic and the Arctic polar sheets were very much bigger. So that, for example, in the south here, winter pack ice came to within 1,000 kilometers to the south of Tasmania. There was much less water in atmospheric circulation, and as a result of that, the sea level dropped to about 150 meters below its present level at about 18,000 years, which is the height of the last ice age. Now, during that time, the sea having dropped that much, that exposed everywhere where you now have Bass Strait. Then you had a huge plain of dry land, probably with a large freshwater lake in the middle of it, so that Australia was joined by land to Tasmania. And what are now the islands, such as the Furneaux group, for example, Flinders Island, and the little islands in the Kent group, such as Deal and Erith and so on, these were then the mountain ranges on the eastern edge of this Bassian plain. And then, of course, as the weather began to warm up about, say, 14,000, 12,000 years ago, that sort of period, the sea level rose and cut off this mountain chain into a series of islands. Now, it seems to me extremely important for us to try and date not only that great geological event, but also to try and date these artifacts from the deposits where they came on the islands, so we can actually place these events in this big geological context that I'm talking about.
Well, you went down to the island and you worked on the spot where it was found. What did you actually find there?
Well, it's a fascinating site. It's called the Swashway Saddle, as you know. It overlooks the Swashway, which is between Erith Island and Dover Island, where you've got this sort of great big wash of water going through this little isthmus. And the site itself is about 60 meters above the Swashway, and it's a series of sand dunes. And nowadays, because of erosion, the wind is whipping the sand off this saddle, and it's revealing a series of superimposed old dunes. Now, where the dunes have been totally swept away on the flat ground, right on the saddle, we found about 2 or 3 dozen stone tools which have been deflated. They've been dropped down onto the surface because the wind has blown the sand away. But we were able to find in one corner of the site a section where all the deposits were still in situ. And you can see the oldest sand deposit we find is the most interesting. It's a pinky, it's got a pink color to it. It's got quite a lot of calcium carbonate in it. And we spent a lot of time trying to find artifacts in situ, that is, in the deposit itself. And actually, we were very lucky. I was digging into the sand, trying to get some pieces of charcoal to date the sand, and I heard a little clink. You can just feel it on your hand, click, like that. And the tip of the trowel had hit one of these little artifacts, which is actually in situ, one of these fluky things, right? And then we were able to dig into the sand, pull out the little artifact, and here was one of the artifacts clearly in position in one of these sand units. What we then did was to take the charcoal from this pink-grey unit, and we got it dated by the radiocarbon dating method, which is like an atomic clock. And the carbon date came out to about 9,000 years, 9,500 years. So we definitely know that people were living on the island about 9,500 years ago.
And that time, of course, it was not an island, but it would have been this sort of hill that sticks up out of the plain. Yeah,
it's a very hard date, actually, 9,500. I wish it had been 12,000. If it was 12,000, I could have stated categorically that Erith Island and Deal and Flinders were all part of the single bridge. But by about 9,000 years ago, the sea had in fact come up, and Erith was an island. So people were living on it while it was an island. The great problem that we've got in trying to reconstruct this this past landscape, is that all sorts of other things were happening as the sea is rising. Such a huge event. You've got masses of sand being pushed up by the sea as it's going up. So there may have been, this is only a guess by the way, there may have been great sand dunes, like sort of sand spits connecting present-day islands for a short while. And then, of course, the sea then worked away at these sand spits and formed the present-day island. So that at 9,000 years ago, I'm not absolutely certain that Erith was totally isolated, because there may have been big sand dunes connecting it, say, with Deal or perhaps with Flinders, which afterwards got washed away. But what we can say is that very short time after 9,000, Erith became fully isolated as an island. And the other thing we can say is that in that section of sand I was talking about, you've got higher units of sand, which we dated to, one was dated to about 6,500, one to 4,000 years ago. Although it's got bones of birds and seals, there's absolutely no evidence for human. There's no charcoal, well, there's some charcoal, but there's no evidence for any human occupation. So the present evidence for this site is that very short time after 9,000 years ago, the island became abandoned by human beings.
Your own way of looking at things comes out, I guess, through your notes.
Yeah, well, I talked about the scientific method. I mean, I can be imaginative, if you like, about what was it like in the Pleistocene, but on the other hand, as I said, one is guided by this very strict discipline, and this is the way that I see nature. Here, for example, is the Swashway Saddle site, as recorded by Ron Lampert, who's my colleague, and myself. And here we have, it's squared off paper, of course, it's a plan. This is the area here, which is where the wind has scoured all the sand off, and we have the fine spots of the various sorts of stone tools. And here is the outcrop of the various sand bluffs, which we are looking into. And then over here, we then do a cross-section. And in this cross-section here, we can see these little outcrops here of the various sorts of sand. Now, what interests me about these sorts of pictures is that this is a highly accurate picture of the section of the sand, and from these various sections we get the charcoal, and from the charcoal we can get a carbon date. But what is interesting is that from these highly objective things, we can then leap into the imaginative phase, because you've got that charcoal date, and the date is, say, 9,000 years, and bang, you then got to think of an entire world which was different to the present world. And that act is an act of imagination. But it's guided by this rather cold, objective sort of discipline.
Rhys was down here with Stephen and historian Ian Turner. On another occasion, Stephen and Ian brought down Fred Williams and Cliff Pugh, the artists, to look at the place from their different viewpoint.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. I mean, I was fascinated at the way you've got this single landscape and you have all these different people with their own perceptions of that same landscape. And I was there as a scientist, as it were, and that my vision is effectively a scientific vision, and it has the discipline of science. And that's why I carry out certain sorts of techniques. I measure, I count, I take soil samples and so on. But archaeology has this other aspect to it, is that it's a highly imaginative effort, in that sense that you have to try and create in your mind imaginary landscapes. Now, you're guided by the scientific method, but on the other hand, to try and push into, say a fundamental question, what was it like? You know, what was the view like? Try and think of yourself back in those times. That requires a great act of imagination. And I find quite fascinating the combination of these two ways of looking at the past. And I know, for example, that Fred Williams, he was painting some of the tips of the old mountain ranges, what he saw, of course, as islands on the edge of the horizon. And of course, I, looking at the same sort of landscape, could see them as the tips of sub-sea mountain ranges just coming up and tipping above the level of the present-day sea, but their feet of the mountains on this Bassian plain that we as geologists can show was in fact exposed to the air during the last ice age. Now, the other thing that's very interesting was the view of history. I mean, archaeology is a kind of a history. And you're working there with someone like Ian Turner, who's one of the doyens of Australian history. And Ian was very interested because he saw himself and, say, myself as looking at a similar kind of manifestation of the past, and yet we're using totally different techniques. That he, as a historian, would be using mostly the written word, what people actually wrote down. Whereas as an archaeologist, what you're trying to do is trying to create a history out of these unconsidered trifles, as somebody said. These are little bits of stone that somebody in the ancient past just casually made. They had no idea that these things would be deposited, would be kept, and that other humans, at a stupendous time afterwards, would pick them up and try and create a history of those makers from these little bits, these unconsidered little bits. And Ian was quite fascinated at our approach, and he actually wrote a little poem about it, which was very nice. He was there writing it, and this is the original copy, in fact. And it's about this, it's about the site, and I'd like to read you the poem. It's got in two halves. It's called Swashway Sandblow, when he was there on the 22nd of January, 1978. He says, "The meal is done. The hunt will soon begin. The hunter sits cross-legged, striking stone on stone. Shrewdly he studies angle, plane, sees through the surface to the knife within. 10,000 years of craft behind his eye, technique prized loose from nature, hardly won. A ritual passed from father down to son, fire first of all, beside him ashes lie." And of course he was looking at the sections and he could see these little bits of charcoal which we were digging out at the time. And then he talks about us then, effectively. That hunter's gone, these 20,000 years. New hunters come with trowel and sieve and tape. From now to Pleistocene, they stretch their span. Their tools are few. The wind-swept stratum cleans some crumbs of charcoal, bones, a minute flake. In that one stone, the history of man. And I was very touched by it because it was a sort of a statement of honor, if you like, from one of the great historians to our own sort of efforts scrabbling in the sand to try and get these one small flake.
That's marvellous.
It was.
This is the second of two programs on Erith Island and Bass Strait. In the first one, I told something of the last 200 years of history of the place, up until the time when in 1974 I picked up a stone artefact that someone had dropped here 9,000 years earlier. Rhys-Jones, the archaeologist from the Australian National University, who came down here to work on the site where I found the artefact, discussed the things he discovered about it and speculated on the changes of sea level that took place in that time and which made this landscape so different from what it is today. Rhys not only looked at the site where I found the artefact, but also at other sites on the island.
Yes, indeed. I mean, what's fascinating about Erith Island is that you have this huge cave, actually, called the Great Cave of Erith, I think, as Stephen called it with his characteristics of the control of the English language. And it's a massive cave, and we've got here drawings of the plan of the cave and also our excavations. But these sorts of documents don't give anything of the feel of this vast site. And to get to it is quite interesting because you've got this great cliff of granite. And at the foot of the cliff, you've got these seas, and they're rather big seas. They come in and wash the foot of the cliff. And then the cave itself is, the foot of the cave is about, I think, 20 meters or 60 feet above sea level. And the top of the cave is about 30 meters or 100 feet above sea level. And to get up to the cave is this great talus, which is like a great mound of rock. And it's quite loose, and it's quite hard to get up to, quite dangerous, actually, to climb up to. And you've got to climb on the very edge of this talus where it's against the cliff wall. But the most difficult thing about the cave was actually getting to the foot of this talus, because there was one place where we had to run between waves. There's this kind of vertical cliff wall and a glistening, slightly sloping downwards little track. And what we had all our gear with us, of course, and we had sieves and food and so on. And what we had to do was to count. You had to say the wave was coming in, and so you counted, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that sort of thing. And as the wave was coming in, you began the count, and at 7, you ran. And you didn't look at this wave, because the wave is now going out, and it's coming back in to get you. And of course, if it catches you, it'll grab you and push you to the sea. So you don't look at the wave, you just do it on this counting thing. And both Ron Lambert and I sort of rushed across this thing, and we did it in little bursts. So we were able to get eventually to the other side of this place and climbed up the talus, and then we lived in the cave, because there was nowhere else to live, and we were there for about 3 or 4 days. And on great stormy days, there's this enormous booming noise in the cave, and there are great whirly-whirlies, I think they're called, where the wind is coming from the west and goes over the ridge of the island and curves backwards and grabs up the water and forms these sort of like water spouts. And the water spouts come out of the sea and they go back against the wind, as it were, because it's going around in this sort of convex way. And there's a highly oceanic feel to it. But we were then excavating in the cave, and we excavated, it was a fascinating sequence. We excavated around about a meter 30, and there were these superimposed layers of gravel, effectively, and it didn't have anything in it except the bones of seabirds. And then there was a very dramatic change where we suddenly came onto clays, and the clay is a brown fawn color, and we knew effectively we were into something quite different. And we suddenly got some bones of wallabies, and the bones were heavily calcined, heavily burnt. Now, there is no way that a broken wallaby bones get into that cave by natural means, and there's certainly no way that wallaby bones get burnt in a cave. So this has to be the remains of some hunter, some human was there in the cave at that time. And the question is that time, because this clay belonged to a period when Erith was not an island. And this is the sort of proof that one wanted for this general theory that one had, that here in this cave was again another element of this proof. Because we looked at the pollen in this clay, and the pollens consisted of a wide variety of plants which don't now exist in Erith, including grasses, and some of the plants are dry, are cold, dry weather plants. And there were little animal bones there which had probably got into the cave by natural means, that is, owls swooping around the cliffs had come into the cave, but the animals were animals that don't exist on Erith now. There were little possums, and there were little marsupials which live in scrubs, which then would have been at the base of the cliff. So from this you can get this picture of the cave exists exactly like it does, but in one's mind that great booming sea had disappeared. And if you looked out of the cave in those times, you wouldn't have seen the sea, but you'd have seen a vast plain extending outwards, and Erith Island would have been like a great tor rising out of this plain. And then we got carbon dates from the base of our sequence in the cave, which was a date of 13,500 years. Now, 13,500 years ago, Erith was this great tor rising out of this Bassian plain.
In your section here, you can see how you've marked these things down. Can you explain that a bit?
Yes, the cave sequence does demonstrate in a very elegant way the two sorts of environments that the cave has been in. In the top half of the sequence, you have these superimposed flat layers, and we've got a carbon date of about 3,000 years from the top here. And this, together with the animal bones, there are these bones of seabirds in these top section here. And this corresponds to the time when the sea was surrounding the base of the cliffs outside the cave. So this is the time when Erith was an island. But underneath that, you've got quite different deposits, which are these brown fawn clays. And we've got a carbon date of 13,000 years from the middle of the clay here. And that is proof that this dates from a time when Erith was not an island, but a tor, a big block of rock rising out of the Bassian plain. And all the animal bones in this clay belongs to the plain. That is, it's the dry land phase. So here we have the dry land phase when Erith was just rising out of the Bassian plain during the last ice age. And then the upper half, Erith has been surrounded by water because the water has melted at the end of the ice age, and this is when Erith is an island. So Erith as part of the plain, Erith as an island.
Well, your descriptions of that tor, that great granite lump of rock sticking out of the plain, must admit that's what I see when I think about the whole island and all of the islands in Bass Strait, just what they must have looked like then. I mean, they look grand now with the sort of marvellous strength that they have from that granite. And that, in a way, must take us back a long way further. If we think back millions rather than thousands of years, we know that the granite was formed as a molten rock that solidified underneath the ground. And it's as if all that top has been taken away too. It's another set of layers that have been peeled off our story, if you like. But perhaps that's further back than we want to go. And if you think about this stone and its geological history, it seems to me that the rocks that are on Erith are the granite that we've been talking about, or limestone, which has been formed from mutton birds and mutton bird eggs and seal bones and so on.
Shells. Yeah.
Shells.
Yep.
So what about this? Where did that come from?
Well, that's very interesting. Looking at the raw materials, it's not just this flake, but also the other stone tools we had from the Swashway saddle site. And what's very interesting is you then try and look at the raw materials from which all of these different stone tools are made. And as you correctly said, not a single raw material is natural to the island. Some of the stones are made from a very hard calcrete. It's an indurated, a hardened limestone. Some of the stone tools come from a quartzite. And the quartzite is a metamorphose, it's a hardened sandstone, and some of it is very high quality. It's got a siliceous structure, and it looks a bit like, it has the same sort of properties as glass. You know, if you take a glass bottle and smash the glass bottle, you have these kind of sharp flakes. Equally, with quartzites, you can do the same thing. Now, the quartzites don't occur on Erith Island. And I'm not quite sure where the closest quartzites are, actually. I think probably on the present mainland of Tasmania. But of course, one has to think that maybe if some of these sites belong to a period when the sea is not there, you have all sorts of potential sources of stone which have since been covered by water.
But surely most of the bottom of that sea, the plain, the Bassian plain, was sandy. It had been sand dunes and things like that.
Yes, it would have been sand dunes, but you'd have localized outcrops, because in fact all you need to get stone is just a small outcrop. I mean, I've been to quarries in Arnhem Land, for example, where Aborigines have been working stone. They use a sharpened stick to make a hole in the ground. They pull out stones. Often they use fire to break the stones up, and they smash them, and then they take off these big flakes, and then they carry the stones. This is what used to happen within living memory. And in Tasmania, we can document quite specific sources of stone, and then we can look at where these stones end up as the discarded flakes. And often they are 20, 30, or 100 kilometers away from the original quarry. And I'm certain that all of the stones on Erith were brought into Erith from very long distances away. Scores of kilometers, perhaps 100 kilometers or more. And that does again bring back the question, the fundamental question, was this site occupied by people when there was still a land connection from Erith somewhere else, across some sort of sand dunes, whatever, or just before the sea had finally risen? Or alternatively, did people have some sort of capacity to cross water? That is, did they have watercraft of some sort? Now, I leave that question as a question because I just don't know the answer to those questions. And we will only be able to get such answers when we refine our dating methods. Not just in Erith, but Erith in the Furneaux group on Flinders Island, and perhaps on Wilson's Promontory as well, when we try and pick up not just a single isolated site, but a pattern of sites which show the old occupation of these land masses of the Bassian Plain and what happened to the people there as the sea came up and isolated them.
I guess this is all conjecture, you know, but this is one of the exciting things. It's a sort of detective story, and part of it that I really like is thinking about that plain. You know, we were talking before about the granite tor and these mountains, these big hills sticking out, perhaps like Arapiles does round in western Victoria.
Very similar to Mount Arapiles.
Yeah, something like that, sticking up out of this plain. But what about the plain? What did that look like? Now, it's my guess, because this didn't only happen once. I mean, this sea level went up and down. It wasn't as if that was just something that happened once. That over all the times that happened, we got this deposit of sand. It's very flat. It's got a very flat bottom when you look at the charts of Bass Strait. What do you think?
Well, let's just concentrate on the height of the last ice age, because we've got more information about that than almost any other period, actually. So you're going back to, say, let's take 18,000 years ago. The weather is colder than at present by 10 degrees Celsius. That's the average temperature. To the south, in Tasmania, the mountains have glaciers on them. Probably, I would imagine, in early summer, you might well have some icebergs coming up on the western coast of Tasmania. It's also much drier than at present. And it's also more windy. And the reason why it's more windy is because the Antarctic ice sheet is expanded, is bigger in area. It's pushed the winds of the Roaring Forties closer to the equator. So you've got the great Roaring Forties winds are now kind of pushed up into southern Victoria. So what I see in Bass Strait, it's cold, it's dry, it's windy, it's dusty. In the bottom of the plain, as it were, there was probably a very large lake somewhere just north of Burnie. And the people have been looking now at the submarine topography of the Bass Strait, and what's fascinating is that they can't find any exit for the major rivers that went into the basin. Rivers, the Tasmanian rivers, like the Tamar, for example, or some of the Gippsland rivers, for example, and even the Yarra River. That there's no exit out over the sill between King and Cape Otway. You can't see the channel, the Paleo Channel. And what this probably means is that it was like a huge, what they call an evaporimeter. The water going in was therefore evaporated out directly, a bit like Lake George, which is the famous one. That's the one near Canberra. but a massive, huge Lake George, perhaps salty at some periods, perhaps fresh at other periods.
Well, one of the things that interests me then is that the tool, if you look at this, that we found in, or that was found in the sand, that sand probably blew up off the plain as they're coming in from the west here somewhere, blowing up, perhaps piling sand up against the side of the cliffs here. Perhaps they weren't even cliffs then, they might have just been a gentle slope that went down onto the plain. But that sand blowing across that plain came up and it formed the sand dune in which the thing was found and which now is blowing away and gradually being eroded.
Yes, it's quite interesting because if you look from the top of the site down into the sea, there's no sand there at present. It's what the mariners call an iron-bound coast. And you do wonder, how is it possible for this sand dune to be up on top of the cliff? And the geologists call these things perched dunes. In other words, they're perched on top of the cliffs. And you find quite a lot of these sand dunes on the islands of Bass Strait. Not only on the Furneaux group on the east, but also on King Island in the west, where I've also found some stone tools. And the theory is that you have a lot of sand on the floor of the strait. Much of it may well be wind-blown in from the Australian continent. And then as the sea comes up, you've got to think of all the energy of the sea piling, as it's moving up, piling sand in front of it in terms of dunes, coastal dunes, and possibly these dunes then building up at the foot of the cliff. And off the dunes, the winds then carry the sand up on top of the cliffs, where they form as this perched dune. Later, the sea then continues to wash away the sand at the base of the cliffs. So that all you've got left of this great phase of sand are these fossilized dunes on top of the cliffs.
Coming back to your lake, you've got this lake in the middle of Bass Strait, your lake, but the lake in the middle of Bass Strait, and the tide is, as it were, coming in, a slow tide of the melting ice and so on, which is gradually coming, at some stage, it's going to break into this lake and make it, and cut it off. Perhaps one side first, so that you might get something then that looked like a giant Port Phillip Bay, and you get the same effect that you get through the heads where you get this rip. And so pretty quickly, there would be a very fierce tide running in and out of there. But because it's only a narrow entrance, it wouldn't be a tide that actually rose the water up and down a great deal, because between tides there wouldn't be enough time for a lot of water to get through. But gradually, as the water kept rising, perhaps that entrance would get bigger. But eventually on the other side, over there, and I think right up near Wilson's Promontory, it would have broken through there again. And when it did that, it's my feeling that it must have happened fairly quickly, that you would have had the effect of the tide on the eastern side of whatever peninsula there was being quite a large tide, but the other one being a bay would have had a much lower fall, rise and fall of tide, so that when they actually met, you would have had a kind of race that developed very quickly between them, and it would have cut away very quickly. I mean, that's just my guess. Do you have any thoughts about that and what it might have meant in terms of people moving from one side to the other?
The Wilson's Promontory area is actually the crucial area. That is between the Wilson's Prom and the northern part of the Kent Group, just north of the cave where we are at, because that is the crucial place where the final land bridge between Tasmania and Australia got cut. And the depths actually are very sensitive in the sense that when the sea is at 64 meters below the present level, there was a plain about 100 kilometre wide. Yet by the time the sea had risen, so it's only 55 meters below, so it's only 10 meters difference, there was a strait 60 kilometers wide. Now, 10 meters, only 30 feet, that's only a couple of large tidal ranges. And you can have the change between a plain and a strait can happen very quickly. And I think that your scenario is in fact correct, that you might have had, just imagine, a series of very high tides, for example, and finally a tide breaks through that last ridge of sand. But once it's done that, you've got these massive tidal races operating, and very quickly you can have great scouring effects and channels forming. And I actually have a catastrophic view, if you like, that the actual break of this final Tasmania Furneaux group on the one hand and the Australian continent, Wilson's Promontory on the other, could have occurred even within the memory of, say, a human generation. I mean, it's within that human scale. Because all these other changes we're talking about are at such a long time scale that nobody is aware of what's happening. I mean, we are not aware that we're in an interglacial period. We don't remember the last glacial, and we have no perception of the next glacial. But these changes, these great water channels and races occurring, might have occurred within the span of a human generation. And putting it into this human scale, you've got to think of people crossing water. In other words, there was once a time when you could go from, say, the summer country to the winter country, for example, and you're crossing over these isthmus, and then you suddenly find there are these channels in it, and then some years later, perhaps a generation later, somebody gets drowned in the channels trying to go across, and then a short time after that, many people get drowned. It's very dangerous, and then suddenly people don't do that crossing. And that happened, that sort of event occurred between about 12,500 and 12,000 years ago. And the people locked to the south of that became the ancestors of the Tasmanian Aborigines. The people to the north were the ancestors of the continental Australian Aborigines. There is, of course, the other question, which is a question I can't answer, is the question of watercraft. We're talking about hunters operating on land. Did they have the capacity to cross water? Now, to get to Australia, people had to cross water, at least 60 to 100 kilometers between Australia and Southeast Asia. So somewhere in those ancient times, 40,000 years ago, some people had some sort of watercraft. That's one aspect. The second aspect, though, is that the southern waters of Bass Strait, particularly the end of the Ice Age, were considerably colder than they are now, and you do have things like wind chill factor and so on, which are quite severe constraints on anybody crossing any substantial amount of the sea. And there's also the possibility that the sort of watercraft found in Tasmania in 1800, and as recorded in the records there, had been a recent invention within Tasmania. So we don't know whether the people at the 12,000 year ago mark had watercraft. But the way to resolve this sort of question is precisely to do research in places like Erith. If we can show certainly, and definitely, we can't at present, but if we could, that there were people on Erith Island at 9,000 years ago, and that time Erith was already a fully sea-girt island, that people were bringing exotic raw materials into that island across, say, 20 kilometers of rough water, then certainly people would have had watercraft. That's the proof of it, if you like. On the other hand, I've talked about the sort of fudge in the system. And we haven't yet worked out the details of the topography as the sea came up. Were there sand spits which have since been washed away? No, I'm leaving those as question marks because I don't know the answer. But this is where geological work will pertain, will be directed onto archaeological or historical questions of very great significance.
Well, both these archaeological and historical questions seem to me to have something in common. They seem to be like this whole exercise. It's a detective story. You're sort of a detective in the modern world looking for something out of the past. And the methods of history and of archaeology are not that different.
The methods are different. I think the aims are the same aims. And then but I think that what archaeology has got, which conventional history has not got, is that huge time scale. I think that archaeologists, of course, don't get to the detail. I mean, we don't know about the lives of individuals at all. Archaeology is this blurred thing. I use the words, the unconsidered trifles, the little bits of charcoal, the bits of stone, those sorts of things. However, archaeology, the positive thing it's got is it's got this huge time scale that we can talk about 2,000 years or 4,000 years, or in this case here, in terms of the history of the Bassian Plain, 20,000 years. Now, 20,000 years is 4 or 5 times as long as the distance that separates us from the Egyptian pyramids. So you're looking into this vast time range beyond that. And you're also looking at humans caught in some ways in these huge climatic and environmental changes, of which they have no control, of course, and they barely perceive that they're happening. Yet these great changes affect their lives fundamentally. And there is, I think, the great question that everybody asks when they're on Erith. They see the stone tools, they look around them at this great sea, which in a sense acts like a prison for anybody who was on that island. You look at the very small number of resources on the island, you ask the question, could people actually live on this island themselves as a small group of people for a long period? And the answer to that has to be no. And therefore the question is, well, what happened to them? And I think that you have to say that this local group of people, the people who made these stone tools and their descendants, became extinct. The population ceased. Now, whether they became extinct at the time when the island was being cut off finally and they decided not to stay on, or that there was a small group that became marooned on the island and lived on for some generations, perhaps many generations, but living on and slowly becoming extinct, we don't know. But we have found now stone tools and other evidence on all of the islands of Bass Strait, Flinders Island, King Island, and also the analogous Kangaroo Island of South Australia. And in all of those islands there were people living there, marooned, as it were, by the sea which had come up, and in all cases they became extinct. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that there are limiting sizes to the human populations, below which, for various reasons, accident or genetic problems, all sorts of things like that, constraints on food, slowly but surely those people, those populations become extinct because they're not big enough to be viable on the very long time scales which we archaeologists can perceive.
In the discussions I had with Rhys, the main problem that we had was that the belief at that time was that the water had actually cut off Erith and Deal about 12,000 years ago, and yet we had a figure of 9,000 odd years for the various finds. But since then, Dr. Wilma Blom, who was doing her PhD at the University of New South Wales, did a study which has given a different date. What she did was to take some drill cores around the area of Bass Strait where the lake that Rhys described before was thought to exist. And what she found in those cores was a number of shellfish and other marine creatures, and we know at what depth under the sea or under the sand these particular creatures live. Now, by taking carbon dates of the actual age of those shells, it was possible to work out both a depth and a date. And by that method, she was able to work out that the lake actually finally broke through on the east side, which was the last place it had to break through, about 8,000 years ago. And this information, of course, would have made it a lot easier for Rhys when he was thinking about the history and the prehistory of the island. Disciplines other than history and archaeology can tell us about the island's past. Beth Gott is an ethnobotanist. She's from Monash University, and she's particularly interested in Aboriginal ethnobotany. Like me, she spent many summers down on the island. What can you tell us about it from a botanist's point of view? Well,
as a botanist, the first thing you always look at in any landscape is the vegetation. And particularly when that vegetation is on an isolated group of islands, you usually ask yourself not only what plants are there, but how they got there in the first place and what ensured that they were able to survive on that particular group of islands. Now, with the Kent group, it's easy enough to see that those alien plants, those plants that were introduced with European man, it's easy enough to see how they got to the island. They comprise, incidentally, about 30% of the plants on the total group. Deal Island and Erith Island have been regularly grazed by cattle and also frequently burned. But when we come to Dover Island, which is very steep and forbidding, it has very dense vegetation, it has never been grazed, and within the memory of European man has never had a fire on it. And there you find that the soil is so undisturbed and the vegetation is so dense that these introduced alien plants have not been able to find a footing, and as a consequence there are very, very few European plants to be found on Dover Island.
Well, it might be obvious how the exotic plants got there, but the native plants had to get there at some time too. What about them?
Well, when you look at the native Australian plants on the Kent group, the most prominent group, of course, are those that are associated with coasts. The coast beard heath, the sea box, the coast tea tree, boobialla, pigface, and the almost universal tussock grass. But in the more sheltered spots in the island, you find species which are characteristic of forest areas on the Australian mainland and on Tasmania. Examples of these can be seen in particularly this one called the musk daisy bush. It's normally found in cool, moist, sheltered slopes and in fern gullies. Now, there were tree ferns also recorded on the group, as well as a number of other ferns which are very characteristic of sheltered gullies. One of the plants that's quite common, especially if there's a good season, is the white elderberry, which has rather creamy berries, which were actually, incidentally, were eaten by Aborigines. And there's also a plant called the stinkwood, and these are all plants of sheltered forests.
The plants that needed shelter must have been sheltered by something, and I suppose that could have been trees. What sort of trees would have been involved?
Yes, trees certainly would have played a part in sheltering these other species, and there are two gum trees which have been recorded on the group. Still on deal and in quite large numbers is what's called the Smithton peppermint. It's a Tasmanian species of eucalypt, and although it's now gone, messmate has also been recorded on deal in the past. And that is a very tall tree of foothills and mountains.
Well, it's interesting that those trees were there, but that still doesn't tell us how they got there. Could they have been dropped by birds or something of that sort?
Well, I suppose it is possible that some of these plants might have arrived perhaps by their seeds being born on the wind or by being carried by birds, but while it is possible for some of those species I've listed, it seems far less likely for the eucalypts and for the stinkwood, for instance, where the seeds are not normally eaten by birds, or it seems unlikely that they would be carried on birds' feet. But there is another alternative explanation, of course, and that is that those plants were there throughout the ice ages when Bass Strait was dry, and that they are actually the remnants of an old forest which clothed those high points along the Bassian rise, which now we see only as the remains of drowned mountains, stretching from Wilson's Promontory right down to Flinders Island. Undoubtedly, the ice ages were drier than today, but nevertheless, any high ground would have intercepted the winds which came from the west across the Bassian Plain, and so this higher ground would have had a higher rainfall than the plain itself, and you can imagine streams flowing down its slopes and draining out onto the plain below, and certainly draining out into that large lake which Wilma Blom has suggested occupied a great deal of the middle of Bass Strait at that time. And it's interesting to see that the examination of the animal remains in the great cave of Erith, which was done by Jeanette Hope, led her to a rather similar conclusion about what the landscape was like during the ice ages, and I'd like to quote what she said. The mountains of the Kent group, at a height of about 400 metres above the level of the plain, would have been an island of forest or heathland in a sea of grass. The cave would have looked out over a deep and wide and, may I add, sheltered valley, which is now Murray Pass. Now, on the more exposed sides and tops of the mountains, it may well have been too windy for trees to grow, so you would have expected a patchwork of vegetation, and with lower vegetation on the more exposed slopes. But it's interesting to think about those hunters on the Swashway site. They were hunting, it seems very probable, red-necked wallaby, which still exists on Deal Island, and which was the animal which was most hunted by the southwestern Tasmanian hunters when they hunted above the tree line at the height of the Ice Age, actually before this period on Erith. But those bones can also, the bones of red-necked wallaby can also be found eroding out of the swashway. So I think it's not too much a stretch of the imagination to say that very probably they were continuing that traditional way of hunting even in those areas where there was no forest. Now, as the sea levels rose in Bass Strait, of course, the coastal vegetation crept up into the forest, and many of the forest species which may have been there, of course, couldn't stand the increased salt from the salt winds, and so disappeared. But we're left with at least, I would say, about 8 species, which in all probability are the relics of that old Ice Age forest on the higher ground.
What fascinates me about the prehistory of Erith is not just the results that we've got, but the method of inquiry. It's interesting to see how archaeologists, botanists, historians have looked at the place. I found, just looking at a few aspects of this small island, a fascinating window on the history of Australia. When that stone was dropped, it was possible to walk from Port Moresby to Hobart. And when I picked it up, there were oil drillers working nearby who were finding cores which dated the geology of the place not just back thousands of years, but back to when it was part of Gondwana land, millions of years ago.